the problem with writing is that you're bound to the words of the English language if you're writing in English, but you're responsible for the combinations you put them into, and you're responsible for trying to describe things in a way that someone else can't.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Artist Toolkit. I'm your host, Nicole Aqua, and this is our second ever episode. So exciting. I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone who downloaded, shared, listened to last week's episode, as that was our first one, and I really do appreciate that. It helped get the podcast off to a really exciting launch, so thank you very much. And today I have another very special guest for you. So in today's episode, I'm in conversation with Douglas Cowie. So let me tell you a little bit more about Douglas Cowie, and then, we'll get into the interview. Douglas Cowie was born in Elmhurst, Illinois, USA, and since 1999 has lived either in England or in Germany. He currently lives in London. He's the author of 2 novels, Owen Noone and the Marauder, and Noone in Paris, 8 in Chicago, and 2 linked novellas, Sing for Life, Tin Pan Alley, and Sing for Life, Away You Rolling River. He is a senior lecturer in creative writing at Royal Holloway, University of London, and he hosts a monthly podcast about contemporary American fiction called NovelRomAntics. I'm going to have all those things I just mentioned linked down below. I really enjoyed my conversation with Doug. You'll notice in the show notes I've also put down some of my favourite quotes from the interview, and it was very difficult to narrow down. We talked all about his writing process, and it was very illuminating for me, very valuable, and I know it's going to bring loads of value to you all as well. Now is probably a really good time to mention that Doug taught me during my undergrad studies at Royal Holloway, and I do feel a little bit sorry for him because I've just been that student that never went away, like, oh, can you be my reference? Also, can you give me career advice? And also, can you please be on my podcast? So, thanks Doug for your endless patience. Doug is also someone who has been incredibly supportive of me in my career, and I really, really appreciate that. In the making of this podcast, I thought quite a lot about who I wanted to invite on to be a guest, and it was really important to me to have people on whose work I admired and also whose character I admired, and I've always been very in awe of Doug's wealth of knowledge when it comes to literature and writing craft. One more thing I want to mention, because we spoke more extensively about Noone in Paris, 8 in Chicago in the actual interview, but I don't think we really introduced what it is. So I just wanted to say that his book chronicles the turbulent affair between Nelson Algren and Simone de Beauvoir, and I'll have that link down below as well so that you can check that out and grab yourself a copy. It's a great book, and I feel like that would just give you a little bit of context before we suddenly start talking about Simone de Beauvoir in the actual interview. And this is a good time to mention that there is also a video version of this podcast if you're listening on Spotify, or if you feel so inclined, if you're a bit like me, sometimes I need a video version of a podcast. I will have that linked below if you're interested. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. Hi Doug, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Nikki?
Yeah, I'm pretty well. I feel like I get very happy when the sun is shining. I'm very easy.
You know what? This year, I was talking about this with a friend of mine a few weeks ago. This year, even more than previous years, I think really in an almost obvious way, because of just being inside all winter, because of lockdown and everything else, when the clocks changed this year was like, I don't even know how to describe it. It just changed everything. It felt like everything had changed. Like there was just that the way the light was different and the difference in time. It just made a huge difference to my sense of, I don't know, well-being, or just at least it kind of made me feel a bit calmer. It was really like in a way that was way more noticeable than years past or anything.
Yeah, same. And I think just the idea of things being open now just makes me very happy.
Yeah.
Even though I've yet to do a lot of going out and all of that.
I never go out a lot at the best of times, but just like the fact that I could, if I wanted to, maybe makes a difference.
Exactly. It's the idea of it. I went out, complete tangent, but I went out last week to a dance class, and there was this massive queue on the street, and I was really confused because it was near a prep, and I was thinking, are people this excited to go to prep? And they were queuing up for a hairdresser, and it was like the whole street, and I was like, wow, okay.
That's what people have missed on lockdown.
Even better and more to the point, I saw a picture of people queuing outside a bookshop on the first day that shops were open, and that made me happy.
Yeah, I thought, yeah, every time I walk past the closed bookshop, I just, a little part of myself dies. But yeah, so for today, I thought it would be really exciting to talk to you about your writing process. And I think process in general has been something that I've been thinking about a lot. But to start off, I thought I'd ask you about what is the first, I guess, piece of writing you wrote? I won't say book, like the first just type of writing. It could be like poetry, it could be prose or whatever, that you looked at and you felt really proud of. You were like, yeah, I'm a writer.
That I wrote. Oh God, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Did I start with a really difficult question?
Yeah, well, it depends on where you start. Because I mean, I wrote things when I was a little kid. Because I had a teacher, in fact, when I was in grade 1 in when I lived in Canada at the time, in the suburbs of Toronto, and I had a teacher there who made us all write little stories. We had these little I forget what they're called. They were like these little characters, the little fuzzy ball with little sticky feet on the bottom, and we had one stuck on the edge of our desks, and
I know what you're talking about. I can see them in my head. Yeah.
And I think they had a particular name. I don't know, but it was like, they had little funny eyes. And anyway, we had these things stuck on our desks, and we had to, I don't know if it was every day or like once a week, we had to write a story that was based on our adventures with this thing. And this, basically the stories we wrote were just like plagiarisms of like the stories we were reading for like to learn how to read, because we were 7. And then we drew pictures to go with them, and she took them home and had them like comb bound. She had a comb binder at home, and she comb bound them and then brought them out. So we had these little books that like, it was like, oh, I wrote a book.
I love that.
And I don't know, like, it would be disingenuous and overly sentimental to say like, and that got me my start in writing, like that. That would just be wrong. On the other hand, it had some impact on me. It's something that I still like can remember, and something that I have thought about from time to time. It's something that I enjoy. I remember enjoying doing it.
Yeah.
And and slavishly imitating whatever. I remember we were reading some story about a boy and his friend who was a rat, or like a pet kind of friend, and I think mine were just basically the exact same stories, but with this little fuzzy.
Change the names slightly.
Yeah. So I guess there's that. I wrote lots of poetry when I was younger, and again from like a pretty young age. I remember writing one that won some kind of prize, like just one of those prizes that like we tell children mean something that don't actually mean anything, again when I was probably like 9 or 10 or something. I don't remember. I just remember it was about, well, in fact, I must have been 10 or 11 now that I've said that, because it was about, it involved the Eiffel Tower somehow. And I don't really remember much more of it besides that. And it has, it was I'm sure it was bad, and I'm sure it all rhymed. And I remember thinking that like that was kind of exciting. I guess there's something about the recognition when you're a kid for things that you've done, whether it's writing or drawing, or hitting a home run or scoring a goal or whatever, like that matters and gives you the confidence that you need to do other things, not just the writing, not just the sport, not just whatever.
Yeah.
So I guess that's where I would start. As for like, if your question is more about like when I wrote something that, well, I don't know, that made me feel like a writer is a different question. So I'm not sure. I'm kind of, that's maybe we should come back to that one. I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, not that I don't feel like a writer, but I don't think there's ever a time where you think, oh, now I know what what being a writer is. It's because that question kind of changes meaning, and the answers to it change meaning as you go along. And I think as soon as people, you can see this with famous writers as well, actually, now that I'm about to say this, But as soon as you feel comfortable, like, oh, I'm a writer, I know what I'm doing, you don't write well. Because it's not, because it suggests that there's some formula you figured out to make things work.
And that you're not still learning and growing.
Yeah, and that you're not pushing to learn something. Well, yeah, so I'm just repeating what you said. But like, to me, writing is about learning stuff, and some of that is about learning structure and whatever, and some of it's about learning information and, in complicated ways. But if you just say, oh, I'm a writer, I know how to do it, and here's the formula that I do, that's a different kind of writing than what I'm interested in, I suppose. But I did also have this is the other thing I should say, is I had a teacher in high school who there was like a creative writing class you could take in my senior year of high school. So I would have been 18, 17 or 18. And Mr. Hendy was his name, Randy Hendy. We had to write something based on a childhood memory or something. And I wrote this thing that was roughly based on the truth of me and my friend down the street used to play baseball all day, every day in the summer. And then almost every day we'd get into some kind of argument about something to do with the baseball we were playing against each other, and, have a great falling out. And then, it would all be fine.
Yeah.
Within minutes or hours or whatever, the next day when it was time to play baseball. And I kind of wrote a fiction based on that. And he gave me a really good grade for it, and said, and beyond the grade, he was like, you're actually really, you're good at this. You're a good writer, right? Which hadn't occurred to me. I don't think I'd ever written a short story before. But I tried really hard on it, and he told me why and what he thought was good about it. And just encouraged me to keep going. And I suppose this has been like the longest answer to your question, but
it's great.
Like, that's the moment where I thought, like, this is something that not only that I like doing, that like I feel like I'm getting something out of doing, but that someone has recognized that it's worthwhile beyond just my own whatever worth I get from it myself. It's worthwhile in some external way as well. Because coming back to the poetry that I wrote, which I don't do anymore, not for a long time, because I just was bad at writing poetry, was that like I think I got some value out of writing poetry myself, but I don't think it was worth much to anybody else because it wasn't very good.
But you enjoy reading poetry, right? Just not writing it?
I read lots of poetry, yeah. I read poetry pretty regularly, and haphazardly, which I quite enjoy. Yeah, I go back to lots of things and reread things, but I also just read new things here and there. And
I picked up, I think you recommended it maybe in your podcast, I'm not sure where, you recommended it somewhere, the anthology Black Girl Magic. I picked that up.
I might have recommended, I might have mentioned that in the podcast. I could have mentioned that almost anywhere, because that I might have just told you directly, read this.
Probably.
Because it's amazing. So I teach that now as well.
Oh, amazing.
And so I teach to first year students the introductions to that anthology, because they're all really interesting. There's 4 of them. There's a foreword and 3 introductions, and they're all pretty short, that are by the editors of the anthology. And what's interesting about them is that they all start from the same place and end in the same place and talk about the same things, but all in slightly different ways.
Yeah. And
which is all kind of makes sense because they're the editors of an anthology and they have this, but they have slightly different, similar things to say. And just to see, well, from the editors, 3 different women, and including the foreword, which is written by not one of the editors of the anthology, 4 different perspectives, all on the same thing, kind of introducing some ideas about what poetry is to them and why it matters and how it works and whatever. It's just really interesting. And there's a lot of different reasons why I teach that, but and I'm not going to give you a 2-hour seminar on it now. But also that anthology has one of my absolute favorite poems ever in it.
Oh, which one?
I'm going to get the title wrong now.
Oh, who's it by?
What I mean when I say I am sharpening my oyster knife, by Eve L. Ewing, who is an amazing and super interesting writer. She's not just a poet; she's all kinds of things. She's a really impressive thinker and writer and artist. But that poem is just like a thing of total excitement and astonishment to me every time I read it. Speaking of rereading, like that's a poem I've reread. I'm really bad at memorizing things. Otherwise I'd just like recite it to you. My books are just out of reach to my left. But it's just an astonishing poem, and genuinely fills me with excitement every time I read it. Like it's, which I think is great. It's not the only thing that poetry does, but it for sure is one of them, and it's one of the things that poem in particular does for me. So yeah. Anyway, sorry. What were you going to say about it?
No, that's no. Literally, I think, what was I going to say? Oh, I think I was just going to say, I was just really pleasantly surprised to find a lot of writers in there whose work I'd read before, but not so much their poetry. So,
all right, that's interesting.
Yeah, some writers in there have written like books or like young adult books or just other things.
Musicians.
Yeah, where I didn't know that they wrote as well. So that was really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the editors of that anthology, Jamila Woods, is a really successful, or I don't know, successful is the right word. I guess it is. That's not really the point, though. She's an amazing musician. She's a great singer. She's a really good lyricist, and her lyrics are she writes differently when she writes lyrics to the way her poetry, that's written for the page, is written. But I mean, she's also like one of her album Legacy from a couple of years ago is, I think, just one of the best albums I've bought in recent years. It's so good. It's really interesting, and it does what it says. Each track is an engagement with a different artist that she considers part of the legacy that has sort of made her as an artist, I suppose, is a way of putting it. And it's just musically, lyrically, everything. It's dynamite. It's really, really good.
Oh, amazing. Well, I'm going to link that as a recommendation down in the show notes. People can check it out. But yeah, actually, that's really interesting. So I wanted to ask you about music as well, because you're a writer and a teacher and a musician and a podcaster. I don't know if I'm missing anything out.
Gosh.
And I was going to ask you whether you feel like those things all inform each other, or like are there elements of them that you try to keep separate?
No, so the answer to the second part of that question is easy, because no. I don't ever try to keep any of these things separate, because I think well, there's lots of different ways of answering that, I guess. One of them is that writing for me is the thing that tries to that I try to bring my life together through. It's like the main tool that I have for bringing experience and interests and everything together into some kind of form, and to try and use that form and that process as a way of trying to understand all those disparate things floating around. So I definitely never try to separate these things out. I think they're all part of the same, they're all part of me doing my thing, making my way through my life. So to separate them out or to draw lines between them, I think would be, at least for me anyway, would be disingenuous. It's just not a way of thinking about things that would really work for me. And so then I guess to answer the first part of the question, now that I've given a very long no as opposed to the short no, I promise, is, they all sort of feed together. I mean, I write about music as well.
Yeah.
I'm writing a novel right now that's about music. And my first novel was about music, and I also have 2 novellas that I wrote that are a linked story about music in different ways. And I used to write reviews and stuff about music, though I don't do so much anymore. So yeah, I mean, they all feed in together in different ways, not always obvious ways. I don't think the ways in which these things feed together are always conscious. Sometimes they are, but I guess maybe these two things go hand in hand, that it's not just that I'm not trying to separate them, is that because these things seem all connected, then that's why I was gonna say one tries to bring them together, one being me. That's why I try to bring them together. Don't know why I was trying to sound fancy.
Like thus one ties them all together.
Heretofore I shall.
No, I think that's really great, because I think if I heard that earlier, this would have made my life a lot easier, because I feel like I spent a lot of time trying to separate out the things that I do. And only last year did I realize actually they're kind of all the same thing. They're just
Yeah,
different lenses to look at them through.
it's funny how, so there's, it maybe not, it might not have made any, I'm not going to tell you about yourself. It might not have made any difference if you probably did hear this earlier. Someone probably did tell you, probably I told you that earlier, not me. But someone probably has told you that before. And because you were young, or because you had better things on your mind at the time, or whatever, you didn't really pay that much attention to it, or you thought, I'm see, now I'm saying you, but I'm really talking about myself. Or you thought like, yeah, but that's fine for that person, but I want to do things this way. And one thing I've noticed in particular when it comes to writing over the last several years is how much lessons that people tried to teach me when I was younger about writing, that I thought, that sounds well-intentioned, but I don't think it works for me, are now things that I was like, I wish I'd just been smart enough to listen to them, actually listen to them and be like, maybe this person has a better idea about writing and life than I do, because I'm only 20 years old. But also, that's part of being 20 years old, is to be told useful things and not paying attention, or think that you know better. And I think it's probably an important part of being 20 years old.
Yeah, you have to question everything yourself,
and you have
right?
to, and you have to get there yourself, and you have to, and I think also probably it's not because it's really easy to sound condescending when you talk about this stuff, and I don't mean it that way at all, because partly it's about you have to do that to some degree when you're 20 in order to figure out what it is that you want to do and who it is that you are, and actually siphoning out some of that advice, or compartmentalizing your life into, this is what I do when I'm serious when I'm over here doing this stuff, and I'm not serious when I'm doing this thing over here. And then at some point, like, you have to do that in order to decide what your priorities are, and how you want to do things, and what you want to do, and where you want to go with them. And then when other opportunities present them as you get older, and you've experienced more things and you've learned some things, you reevaluate those things, and you're like, oh, it was dumb of me to dismiss that as serious just because I was enjoying it. Or it was stupid of me to not enjoy that just because I decided it was serious, or whatever. And you redo things. I mean, we all wish we know what we know in middle age, like we knew when we were 20, so we could use it better, but like that's not how it works ever. So who cares? I'm not gonna I'm not gonna spend time regretting what I did or didn't do when I was 20 just because I know better now, or think I know better now, or whatever. Like, those were lessons that I had to learn one way or another about writing, about how to interact with life itself, whatever. So yeah, don't beat yourself up over not having paid attention to that advice earlier, and don't lie to yourself about having not been told it. Those are my two.
I know, I'm like, I just had an epiphany, but really it comes from years and years of conversations.
Yeah, but that's how epiphanies come, though. Like, they seem to come out of nowhere, but actually you've been paying attention to a bunch of stuff for a long time in order to reach it, right? It's again, coming back to your starting point of process. Epiphanies are just the result of process, some of which is, again, like a conscious process, some of it's an unconscious process, some of it you deliberately try and like strive towards, or like you sort of like work like, oh, I need to learn this, I need to have an epiphany about this thing, so I set out and do these things to learn, and then the epiphany happens or doesn't. And some things just come to you because you've been doing enough other stuff, and the epiphany lodges itself inside of you at some point.
Yeah.
I'm really desperately, through this entire part of the conversation, trying not to talk about T.S. Eliot.
Hey, we can talk about T.S. Eliot.
Because he talks about these things in Tradition in the Individual Talent. He talks about these things. And he says, so the two things is, one, he says that like, he says a poet can't form themselves on one or two private admirations only. And then in like more or less the next breath, he says that's an important experience of youth. So this is exactly what I was just talking about, with like, you have to kind of ignore stuff and like, and cultivate these particular interests to the detriment of other stuff that would be healthy for you when you're young, because it's an important experience of youth, is what he says. And then the other is that like he says like bad poetry sometimes is because the poet is conscious where he should be unconscious, and unconscious where he should be conscious, and there's a bit more to it than that. But like, that's in a way a similar description of what I've just been talking about, like where like sometimes you really have to deliberately decide you want to learn something and have an epiphany about it, and sometimes it just seems to come to you unconsciously or subconsciously, rises up into your consciousness, but actually you've been doing the work somewhere to make that happen. It's not like some, you know, you're just some pulsing consciousness that eventually pulses enough times to have a thought fly out of it. That's not how it works. You wouldn't need to read books if that were the case.
Yeah, the thoughts are always there subconsciously, I guess.
Yeah, well, or they're developing subconsciously, because you're reading something and you're reading it to pay attention to X, Y, and Z, but you know, W is coming along for the ride as well. You just haven't noticed yet.
Yeah, nice. How much of it for you is enjoying process for process's sake? Because again, this is something I've been thinking about in terms of, I feel like part of me wants to really enjoy a process just because it's process and I'm learning and I'm growing. But then part of me, which I think is just influenced by like the capitalist side of the world, is like, actually, no, outcome is the most important thing. And I don't know, I guess it's a mixture of both. But do you ever find yourself writing things just to explore them, or do you always think of the end goal?
I don't know. I think of them as going hand in hand. It depends on what you mean by the end goal and about what you mean by the outcome. Like, I don't think I need to, like, a thing doesn't need to be published and out in the world in that public way for me to decide that it's been useful or successful in some way. It's a different, like, obviously there's a different kind of success and a desirable kind of success to be had in publishing things and people telling, you know, it's nice for a stranger to tell you that they liked your book or whatever. But it's not the only important thing, and it's not the most important thing necessarily, although at times it feels like it is, and at times maybe it is the most important thing. But if the process itself isn't the most important thing, then why bother? This I guess that comes a little bit back to what I was saying earlier about, like, you know, when you thought like, yeah, I figured out how to be a writer. I know that wasn't what your question was, but like, it's like, well, you know, if you're only doing it by a formula to achieve the product at the end that you convert into money, there's nothing wrong with converting it into a product for money. Like, I'm not dismissing that, but if that's the only thing you're doing and you're doing it by a formula that works, well, what are you getting out of that besides the money? I don't know. Which is fine. You know, the money is fine. But like, to me, the point of artistic endeavor is to learn something and to try things. And you have to learn by trying things, by experimenting, by messing around, by risking the failure of things on bigger and smaller scales. I mean, I've written unpublishable novels. I didn't not learn from doing it though. A better way of saying that would be I learned from doing. I learned
from writing.
I learned how easy it is to write a bad novel. I learned, you know, some good things along the way as well. Yeah, the process is everything as far as I'm concerned. Like,
yeah.
Which isn't to say that the end goal isn't also in mind and isn't also important, but it is also that end goal is means different things as you go, and the process changes as you go, but the process there is the most important thing. When I set out to write my last novel, Noon in Paris, 8 in Chicago, available from all good bookstores, that was, I think, the one where it really, in particular, solidified in my mind. I think more than anything I'd written before, I really asked myself the question, like, why are you writing this? Partly because of the subject. And it was like, are you really going to write this novel? And why are you doing it? And there's I kind of had to ask myself that at the outset of the process. And then I had something happened that really put that question into relief for me, which is that a film was announced on exactly the same subject. So a film that never got made, or if it got made, it didn't get released. And I don't know why exactly, but anyway, it doesn't matter. It's something that people could look up if they wanted to do a bit of internet digging around. But it was like, oh, I can't write a novel about Simone de Beauvoir and Nelson Algren if there's a film that is definitely going to be out long before I finish this novel. Like I was just about to start. I can't remember exactly the timing, but I think I was probably just about to start writing. Like I'd done most of my research and was about to start writing a first draft of it. That torpedoes the commercial potential of this novel because there's a film there. But then I thought, but I was like, well, I'm not. I've been working on this for years. Like I'm not gonna, and I care about it. And I had to ask myself, well, then why are you doing it? Like, and it was like, well, actually, there's things I want to learn by doing this. There's a bunch of stuff I want to learn by doing this, and it doesn't matter if the novel, or sorry, if the film is great, is terrible, happens. It doesn't change the fact that I have a novel that I want to write for my reasons, to learn the things that I want to learn that I can't learn any other way than by writing this novel. And nothing else about the same subject that's out there matters in there. So it might inform it, and lots of stuff that's out there does inform it, but for my own purpose, my own process, and what I want to get out of it, nothing else matters. So I decided, like, okay, even if this ends up being from a commercial point of view, from a publication point of view, the possibility of publication might vanish because of in the end, the film didn't get made, and it doesn't matter, and the novel was published. I still want to do this, and I still have things to do. So I did it, but it could have been a really disastrous endeavor from that superficial, not entirely superficial, but like that outside point of view. But that actually, that's why some of the advice that I ignored when I was younger strikes me as the best advice I've ever been given about writing, which is to get a job that pays your bills and allows you time to write, which I repeat constantly to like anyone who falls within my orbit in some sort of teacher-student constellation, because it really is that important. It was told to me by a much more successful writer than I am or probably will ever be, and it occurs to me that someone with the experience of the person who said that, who says that, really knows what they're talking about. And it also then means for me, the big thing about that is it frees me up to write about whatever I want to, because I'm not relying on feeding myself through the writing.
You can let the writing do what it needs to do, I guess. And you can do what you want to do.
Exactly.
Cool. Shall we go a bit more specific?
Sure.
Let's go into routine, which is slightly different from process, but in the same orbit. Let's go pre-COVID. What did your writing routine look like, if you can remember that far back?
My writing, well, it's easy. My writing routine has barely changed, is one of the things that has sort of been helpful in getting me through pandemics and lockdowns and all that kind of stuff, because it's a routine, and because it works really well for me. I think it's important in like thinking about writing routines and writing habits that like it's so easy to pronounce on this stuff, I think, and be like, this is what like you should do if you're a writer. And I think this comes back again to your first question. It's like, well, there's some notion that I think is worth fighting against, that if you do certain things, then you're a writer, or if you don't do certain things, then you're not a writer, which is really the part that's worse. Because I certainly felt this when I was younger, like, oh, if I don't do these things, then how can I ever call myself a writer? Or I'll never become a writer because I'm not doing, I'm not like Ernest Hemingway getting up at the crack of dawn and standing at my desk typing on the typewriter and blah 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 blah, and then going out fishing and killing stuff and whatever, finding new wives. And it's really easy to mistake someone else's routine for the only way of doing things, or whatever. And so anyway, that's a long disclaimer that this is just what works for me, and it's kind of a series of trials and errors over time that have got me to it. But when I'm writing, and I think it's important to put it that way as well, because I do other stuff and I don't always have time to write or inclination to write or whatever. But when I'm writing something, basically I get up and I have breakfast and I sit down and I write. My writing day is usually a couple of hours long. So I only really write in the mornings. Occasionally, I think at every novel I've written, I've probably had like 2 or 3 times where I've written a little bit in the afternoon or evening, just because suddenly I was like, I had an epiphany. And suddenly there was something that I thought, oh, that would be a good idea. Oh, I'll just do it now because I know I can bang it out in half an hour or something and have it down. But otherwise, I write for 2 or 3 hours. I tried. The big thing for me is not so much how long I spend writing, is how much writing I get done in a session. And my goal is always to write 250 words, because double space, that's about a page. And in practice, I always write more than that. So that's the other reason why that's the goal. It's because it's achievable. And I don't see the point in setting myself, some lofty, unachievable goal, or some goal that I can reach but not reach well. Because the way this is the part where it's like, whatever works for you is more important than whatever works for me, because what works for me is what works for me. But I try to write, like, the words that I have down at the end of a day of writing, I try to have them be really good. They all get rewritten eventually anyway, but that's further down the line. But like, I want to have something. I don't write anything deliberately going like, well, this is a bit crappy, but it'll do. I don't like that. But I don't either obsess about every last word and comma, like, because I know there's a time where I'm going to change them later. Yeah. In fact, there's more than one. There's times when I'm going to change them later, again and again. But I do try to make them good and readable, and like, that I'm happy enough. And then I start each day by rereading what I wrote the day before.
Okay.
Sometimes a little more. I don't really make many. I'll sometimes make some superficial changes, but not much. That's just basically to get me back going, because I always stop when I know what I'm going to do next. The process always starts from a point where yesterday I left off knowing what I wanted to do tomorrow, or today. Mm-hmm. Yesterday I left off knowing what I want to do today. Today I'll leave off knowing what I want to do tomorrow. And then I pick up and I try to write that. And what happens very quickly is I don't know what I'm doing, and I have to figure it out. And I write usually between 400 and 600 words. And by the end of that, I've usually gotten through part of a scene, and I know what the next move I want to make in the scene is. And so I leave it there with a note, and pick up there the next day and do the same thing, because knowing what I'm going to do is part of the process of keeping it going, preventing writer's block and that kind of thing. Like, just always knowing where I'm going. And I have huge plans. I have huge plans for myself. I have a lot of plans. I make lots of plans, and I work to a plan that is constantly evolving and changing, but there's always a structure in place. I always know where I'm going. I never start writing a novel without knowing roughly how I want it to end.
Okay. Yeah.
Because otherwise I think it's everything else about it is so frightening, that not knowing what I want to achieve just from a basic plot point of view would just be a mess for me.
Yeah. And I guess it saves you time when you go back and edit as well, if you have some idea of the plan, right?
Yeah. I don't know if it saves time, but it means you've always got a structure, and when you go back to edit, you look at that structure and think, oh, this isn't, it never turns out, the novel never comes out the way that the structure was. But it's usually some sort of approximation of it, and that's fine. But you can go back and say, like, oh, how does this match up? What did I lose by changing this thing along the way? Do I want to gain some of that back? Also, there's just too much stuff to remember. So having it written down in plans and notes form is helpful. Because if you're going to try and keep it all in your head and write a whole novel, forget it. That last novel took me about 8 years to write. It's too long to hold that much stuff in your head.
Yeah.
It's unreasonable.
Because I feel like sometimes I think, oh my gosh, I've taken so long to work on this thing. And it's nice to speak to people where they're like, I've worked on this for 4 years or 8 years, like you just said. Or
very few things that you really like and that are really good get written very quickly. Even if like the first draft of it got written quickly, there's so much other stuff involved. Again, it comes back to like that. I guess that would be like a quickly written first draft is like the epiphany at the end of all this thinking and planning and whatever from earlier. And then you have to do all the rewriting and revising. It's never a short process. Even the most quickly written novels go through at publication stage, go through editorial processes that drag it out. And so it's always longer. But also, again, if you've got a job that pays your bills, you can take that time and do it the way you want to do it. And no one's like, I don't have a contract. I've never written a novel with a contract for it before it was written. And so no one's like, literally no one is holding their breath waiting for my next novel, which I think is good. This is something else that I sometimes say to students is like, the world doesn't need your novel. It's not holding its breath waiting for it. And that's kind of depressing, but at the same time, it frees you up to do what you want.
Yeah. I have a really specific question about Noon in Paris 8 in Chicago. Really specific, in terms of when you were writing it, because what I loved about it, so I've actually read it twice now, which is very rare for me because I don't reread books. So.
Well done.
No, it's a high compliment.
It's a feather,
I really enjoyed it.
Cap.
Like I honestly never reread, so yeah. And I was wondering about, I guess, from the journey from like first draft to what you published, did you always know, I guess, the style in which you were going to write it? I'm just thinking specifically about, there's that balance between Nelson's voice and then Simone's voice, and then there's also the author's voice. Like, or did you just have to get the story down and then go back and change it?
No, so that's a really good question. That's a really, really good question. And the answer to that, the short version of the answer to that is like, that's the last decision I made before I started writing the first draft.
Okay.
That like the whole time that from the point at which it was starting to, like, I started to figure out what kind of shape I wanted the plot to have and that kind of thing. That there was always this question of point of view. And I can give another like long speech about point of view, but I won't. But the short version is, I think point of view is the most important decision that a fiction writer makes about their work of fiction. Because it's the bias that colors everything else that happens. Because once you've decided how your point of view is going to work, you have to stick with it. And it changes the way the story is understood. It changes the way the story is told. Because like, if I'm telling the story, it means one thing from my point of view. If you're telling the story, it's a different story. You bring different things, I bring different things. A different narrator brings a different lens to a story. Anyway, so that was always the thing. And it was the important thing. There's quite a lot of different dynamics involved in that story. And the important thing was not to let either personality, neither Simone de Beauvoir nor Nelson Algren, dominate too much the novel as a whole. So each of them dominates certain scenes, for sure. But it couldn't be that I didn't want someone to get to the end of the novel. I didn't want myself. to get to the end of the novel, because it also runs counter to some of the things I was trying to learn by writing the novel in the first place, and be like, well, I've just told Nelson Algren's side of the story, or I've just told Simone de Beauvoir's side of the story. Of course, I've told neither those things because they're fictional characters, but I wanted to try and create a balance between, or some kind of balance between both perspectives. And then I had to think quite a lot about how to do that. And I decided to do it through a third person narrator. Partly because I don't really like, as a rule, novels that give you multiple first person narrators.
Okay.
Now, there's a million exceptions to that rule. I'll add quickly as a footnote. but it seems to me, in a lot of cases, like it's a bit of a cheap trick, or it's a bit of a cop out, because you're just allowing every perspective into it in a way, if you're using multiple first person narrators, in a way that, if you're not careful, can become sloppy and lazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And also that you're partly doing, I don't know, to like, as an easy way or as a noticeable way of like doing the police in different voices, like I just don't, it makes me feel uneasy. And then partly because I like the idea of there being a kind of, so this is the third voice you were talking about, and an authority over the story that lies outside the characters. Like, it's not a mistake that author is the same root, right? Like author and authority. And so it's not that it's my voice as the author, it's a narrator's voice that creeps into that novel. It's always there because it's always in third person, but there's like 2 or 3 times in the novel where the narrator, you're not like right behind either Algren or Beauvoir's point of view. There's like a very clear pulling back from the narrator for like 1 or 2 lines.
Yeah.
And usually because the narrator ridicules them in some way. And then it goes back to one or the other of them. But I like that, the shaping that authority of a narrator gives to something. And I think especially that novel needs that, or that story rather, needs that kind of sense of shape being given, partly because it's not really, there's no story to start with. It's like 2 people had a relationship for 18 years. It's not like those things don't have, as they exist in life, they don't have story to them. We impose story upon them. We give them narrative shape, and I had to, as the writer of this particular story, give it narrative shape. And that was really hard to think about, like, how can I give this, a beginning and a middle and an end.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy to become flabby if you're writing in 2 different first persons or whatever. And I didn't want it to just be from one side. And then it became very interesting to probe some of those spaces between their 2 points of view and have that little bit of distance outside of them to do it. And also to play around with when it switched. As I was going, I usually had an idea of whose point of view I wanted for what scenes. I didn't have it necessarily written down in the plan ahead of time, but I usually had a pretty good idea of who I wanted to use as the main kind of point of view for any given scene. And I always had a reason why, but then some scenes I really had to like decide and sit there. So like back to my writing routine, on those days, it kind of consisted of me sitting at the desk going, oh, for like half an hour of just sort of staring and thinking and distracting myself and thinking like, what, how do I want to position this scene? And most importantly, why? What am I losing if this scene is Beauvoir telling it or Algren telling it? And then there's the ones where it switches between them. I did that sparingly, I think, but always with a real point. There's always a real point to it when it's switching in the middle of a scene between one of their points of view and the other. It's usually when there's some real misunderstanding at stake, usually, but not always. There is one sentence that switches point of view. My crowning achievement as a writer. I'm so proud of myself. I'll never stop talking about this. I switched point of view in the middle of a sentence, and I'll always be happy that I managed to do it.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I remember that's really interesting about not wanting either voice to dominate, because I remember getting to the end of the book and just being really torn because I didn't feel like I was being told whose side to be on, which obviously I know that you weren't trying to do, but I feel like sometimes you read books and you just, you know where you're falling. So it was like very gray for me. I was like, oh, I don't know.
Maybe that was I
don't need to know.
That was one of the guiding principles of writing that, was like, you can never take sides, you being me, like as the writer, like don't ever take sides. There's times where I definitely had a side as a person, like, or I thought like, man, why are you being such a jerk to her? Or man, why are you being such a jerk to him? Or man, you guys are kind of both jerks, there's but from the point of view of the writer, I never wanted to take a side on that, even where it seemed obvious to me where I would take the side.
Yeah,
it's interesting you say when you get to the end. One of the problems I had with figuring out how to structure that novel was where to end. I was terrified about how to end it, and I had it. So like I said earlier, I always know what the ending is, and that's both true and untrue in this case. Like I knew where I wanted to get to and what the kind of landing point was for the end, but I didn't quite know how to do it until I got there. And even when I got there, I was like, oh my God, is this like really how I'm going to do it? And then the real problem was that I had to choose whose point of view is going to get the final word. And what does it mean to give that person's point of view the final word? And in the end, I don't know, my lad, like,
oh yeah, you can say. I was just trying hard not to do really, any spoilers or anything.
It's not really a spoiler alert. In the end, like I gave Algren more or less the final word, and quite in quite strong terms, the final word. Not without misgivings, but I also felt like there's a bunch of different reasons, I guess. To be fair, what I'm about to say is I'm slightly making it up as I say it. So I wouldn't take it as like the gospel truth of like exactly what I was thinking at the moment that I made this decision. I don't think that's never possible. And now I'm thinking of Ralph Ellison. At the beginning of his introduction to Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison says, right, as a writer trying to explain why or how they did something is like, it's like trying to coax a genie back into the bottle, and even worse, into the keys of a now defunct typewriter, which I think is such a nice thing. And then he goes on to say all kinds of interesting things about his novel. But I'm kind of making this up a little bit, but it was like Beauvoir outlived Algren. She's much more famous than Algren. I mean, rightly so. Her story in general is more well known than his, and I think I was, and like, he's the guy who I came to that story through him, and I think all of those things played a part in giving him the final word. Also, he broke off the relationship, not her, which would also maybe be an argument for giving her the final words. But the novel starts with her learning of his death, having not spoken to him for years. This is one of my great tricks. It's like, tell the end of the story at the beginning, and then you can't have spoilers. I did that in my first novel as well. My first novel opens with the end, and then the narrator says, like, everybody knows the end of the story. Like, now this is the beginning. And so you like, and so she's kind of had the final word already at the beginning, and then he gets the final word at the end. It was a tricky decision. I still feel a little bit like it still feels tricky to me whenever I look at that final page. On the other hand, I kind of knew I suppose I went into it with my eyes open. I knew the compromises I was making. I could basically write the criticism of it as well.
Yeah.
And I thought, as long as I can do that and I know what I'm doing, then I'm going to stick with what. And I had conversations with stick with what I decided. I had conversations with lots of people about it as well, friends who read it for me, my editor, and
Yeah. Cool. I feel like now feels like a good time to, because I asked you if you wouldn't mind bringing like your notebook, which shows a bit of your planning. Anything that doesn't give anything away.
Oh, it doesn't matter. There's nothing to give. I've got them all right here. So here's the book.
Hey.
I actually have two notebooks for, every novel really, but this one. So when I have an idea that I realize is going to be a novel, or I think will be a novel, I start a notebook for it. And it's always this kind of notebook. It's they're really cheap. I like the size of them, I guess. I put some stickers on the front, and I just write down the notes that occur to me as they occur to me, and I number them. So
So do you carry it around with you?
No, because I don't want to lose it. So I often write things down on scraps of paper or whatever, but then they'll get transferred to this notebook, and I just number. So there's 303 numbered notes in this notebook, and they're just like, they're anything from like, I can just show a page. I don't even know what that page is. It's just right here as well. It's got a lot more stickers on it. This one has 543 numbered notes in it. So quite a few.
Oh my gosh.
But like, I just write them down and I number them, and the number is just there for reference, like just so I have something to refer to, so I don't have to write the whole note out ever again. And then whenever the point arrives where I think it's time to start planning this novel and get down to writing it, like writing the actual prose, then I make lots of outlines. This is the part that you were particularly interested in, I guess. And so the first thing I do is I have an outline of the whole novel on one page.
Okay.
So in the case of this novel, it's hard to sort of recreate in this conversation because they're not static things. Like I use the outlines and I constantly add to them and write on them and make notes to myself on them. They're working documents. But like I made, so like here I have Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then there's subdivisions to each of that: A, B, C, and D, F, G, H. So for each of those Roman numerals, I did an outline on one page. And then I left a blank page that's no longer blank next to it, so I could write extra notes.
Right, okay.
And that's where I got into more detail. And I went through that notebook. And the numbers are all here in circles in the space where I think they're relevant. So like whatever those randomly recorded notes all get placed in some part of the outline. And there's, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then an extra. That's where I worked out that epilogue I was just talking about. And then all of the numbers are in there somewhere. And then all this sits out on the desk next to me while I'm writing, so I can keep referring to it, going back to the notebooks. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 books, a notebook, 2 notebooks out open on my desk now for the novel I'm writing now. It's just a way of keeping everything. I said earlier, like, you can't remember all this stuff. So it's just a way of keeping it all in front of me and kind of in view and in a shape that I can kind of imagine. Because otherwise it's too much stuff to imagine into a single shape that a novel needs to be.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. Yeah, because I was really curious because I remember seeing a picture once of it and just being like,
you freaked out. You emailed me or something. You're like, what is this?
What is this? This is like maths and English combined. I don't know. There's like numbers everywhere. And I don't know. It was just funny because, every now and then I like read a book and I'm just like, why am I even writing? And then for you, even your plan was like, this plan is more complicated than my entire.
I have to say the plan the way that I've planned, it's kind of evolved every time I've written another novel and gotten slightly more complicated in some ways. Like the first novel, I had like a basic outline, and then I was kind of doing that numbering system as I went. I was basically writing just a little. I knew where I wanted to go with it. I knew like I said, I literally wrote the end as the first page of the novel.
Yeah.
So I knew what I was doing, and I knew what the like key plot points were. But then every time I was ready to write another chapter or towards another plot point, I sort of did this, like wrote down the things, put notes that I looked at notes that I'd been making and like outlined them. And when it came time to try to write a novel again, I thought, what if I just did all of that before I started? It would just kind of make things make a bit more sense and a bit more secure. So yeah, the one that I'm working on now has way more pages than that, and it was a bit of more of a mess to try and organize it into a shape, into a plot. But I've done it. It includes like I made up a city for the novel I'm working on now, so it has like street maps that I made up.
Exciting. Okay, questions.
Yeah.
What are you working on now? And you don't have to go crazy amount of detail. And then my second question is, do you have any specific like writing rituals or like superstitions? I'm just always curious about those.
What I'm writing now is another novel about music. It's about people who well, there's a group of people who pass through a town and they stop for food, and the bar next door to where they've stopped for food is closing. It's like the last night of the bar, the guy is retiring, whatever. And there's all these people in there playing music, and they join in. And in the course of this, one of them decides to take the bar over, but it's no longer a bar, and turn it into a community center where people can make music. And it's about the people who start drifting into this place to make music, mostly teenagers who don't have anything else to do really in this town, and the kinds of music that they make together and what it means to them to be making music, all these different people together. There's quite a bit more to it than that, but it's the short version is it's about music making as community. And it's got a huge cast of characters, which is why there's so many pages of notes and stuff, because there's just so many people to kind of manage.
Yeah. That sounds amazing.
Unlike just two, which are unmanageable people, but they are easier to manage as characters, I suppose. Rituals. Don't know. Do I have rituals? I tend to listen to music when I write, but I don't know if that counts as a ritual. That's more of a tool. It's partly about helping block out distraction, and it's also partly about mood, creating mood. I always write in the mornings, as I said earlier. I don't know that I have like particular rituals about it. Not that I can think of. I'll probably like after we've finished, I'll be like, actually, I don't like tap my pen 3 times on each side of the desk before I start or anything. I just kind of get down to it and get going.
Just start.
I think in part for me, and this comes back to some of the other things I've been talking about, I guess, is like, I just don't think of writing as a particularly ritualistic or mystical undertaking. It's like it's a part of my day-to-day life. And like the actual writing is part of that. The thinking about writing, the teaching about writing, the reading, the listening to music is all part of that day-to-day life. And so it's not, I think, to like turn things into rituals, like as though it's something more exalted and specialer than other things I'm doing, would be disingenuous to me. It's not to say that it shouldn't be that way for other people. And it's not to say that it's not important. And it is like basically the most important thing I do, as far as how I kind of think about myself and how I walk through the world. But I don't think I feel like I need to make rituals out of that. This is partly also why I have to start my day with it. It's like I can't get the day going without it. That's not true, actually, now that I've said that. But I can't do, if I am writing, I can't really do anything else until I've gotten the writing done, because it's cleared something out of my mind that
Okay.
otherwise isn't there.
You're quite pragmatic with it, I guess.
Yeah, extremely, I would say.
Great. I thought it'd be really fun to end on some really like fast fire, like quick round questions. So
do I need to get my buzzer? I'll buzz in.
You have like 10 seconds. Shall we say 10 seconds per question?
Okay.
I'm not timing it or anything.
I'm not good at that.
It's just like the first thing that comes to your mind with these questions. Okay. So the first one, what is something about writing that you learned the hard way?
Oh man. That's a quick fire question. That's horrible. What's something about writing that I learned the hard way? I suppose that so this is gonna be longer than 10 seconds, sorry. The thing I learned the hard way, I think everyone learns the hard way, is that when it comes to the publishing world and the market and the kind of capitalism side of things, is that none of it is to be taken for granted. And past success is no guarantee of future success when it comes to putting a book out into the public and to publishing it, to marketing it, whatever. Nobody cares. I mean, that's a bit disingenuous. People do care about what you've done before, but just because you've published a novel before doesn't mean that every novel you write is good. You have to work really hard, and you have to be lucky, and there's so many different little things at play in that. And so to not take that for granted, not to take that kind of commercial success for granted, is something that I think everyone learns the hard way. And I am not an exception to that. And everything else, I mean, everything you learn in writing, you learn the hard way, because you got to do it and you got to figure it out. And like, I can sit here and tell you, here's a way to write, here's a way to not write, here's a thing that works, here's a thing that probably doesn't work, but you still got to do it. I mean, you know this yourself because you've written lots of stuff. And you know, you only learn how to do things that work by doing things that don't work. But actually, I think some of that hard way is it becomes a confidence builder, because it means that when you've learned something the hard way, you realize what's at stake when you want to risk something, and if it fails, and you realize that there's basically nothing at stake. Like you can risk, like it's really high risk writing, but because no one actually really cares until the thing is out there and they act like they cared all along, there's no danger in failing at writing if you're not paying your bills with it. Like you risk, oh, I wonder if I can pull off this stylistic thing. I wonder if I can change points of view in the middle of a sentence. Well, I'm going to try, and I'm going to leave it there. And if nobody says anything about it, then I pulled it off. And like, you know, and then I can brag about it in every podcast I ever go on ever again. And there's like, if it hadn't worked, the result would have been, oh, it didn't work. I learned that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so then you get the confidence to risk something again.
Yeah.
And then you have to also learn to be honest about where it works and where it doesn't work, which is hard as well. So everything is the answer. That was
Love
more
that.
than 10 seconds.
That was not quick fire, but it's fine. It's all good.
You can edit it down to the part where I said everything.
Yeah, that's it. Simple. No, it was really good. Actually, to make it slightly less even quick fire, it just what you were saying made me think about last summer. I attempted to write my first ever novella, and I was like so confident going into it. I was like, we've got this, a loose plan, a loose outline. I really like the concept. It did not turn out well. It was shocking, like how bad it was. And actually to this day, I have not read it back. So I'm like, I just know it was bad. Like even as I was writing it, I know this is bad. But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, well, now I know not to try and write. I mean, that particular idea, I think, works better as a screenplay. So I was like, now I know.
Yeah, that's interesting, though. Like, that's part of what you learn by trying the thing out, though, and it being a miserable failure or whatever. Like, you know, I say miserable failure because I've been in the same position, you know, and you think, well, God, I just wasted 2 years of my life writing a failure of a novel. Well, was it a waste? I don't know. Like if the process is what matters, then it's not a waste. Like I learned something. I learned that actually this idea doesn't work as prose because it's a visual idea, and so I'm going to turn it into a screenplay or whatever. Or I learned that actually what I really want to do is put this on a stage and act it out or whatever, get other people to act it out. So there's or any number of other things, but I think that's part of what really matters and is interesting about the whole process. It's hard to remind yourself of that all the time because it does get depressing and demoralizing, but at the same time, it's a long game.
Yeah, that's so true. I remember once when I was writing my book, which you read for me, thank you very much for that. And I remember asking a question about it, about this final section, maybe changing point of view. And I wasn't sure about it. And then you were like, oh, but you know, if you're not sure about it, you can always rewrite it afterwards. That stressed
and you're like, no,
so
I don't want to rewrite anything ever. Every word I write is so precious.
I was like, but do you know how long it will take to rewrite this? But now I'm like, well, yeah, obviously just rewrite it, it's fine. But
if it takes a long time, it takes a long time. I know. This is one of those things. This is one of those things that people tell you when you're you were a little older than 20 at that point, but like this is one of those things that people tell you when you're young or you're an inexperienced writer, that they're telling you from experience that you need to be told and you need to not really get, because you can't get it.
You're like, you don't get it.
You can't get it until you do it, until you realize, oh yeah, like I can just rewrite it. It's like, of course I can just rewrite it.
It's not that deep.
It seems so precious and so frightening when you've not done it before, but like, everything else works that way too. It's not that different from other things you do in life that well, so you're an actor. Like one of the things, let me tell you about acting, Nikki. You can say a line this way and maybe it doesn't achieve the effect. Or like if it's like a funny line, you say it this way and it doesn't get the laugh. So you find a different way to say it. You can always say it a different way.
Yeah.
And like, or, you want the audience to burst into tears when you say it. So you have to say it a different way or whatever. It's not that different. It's just,
I like that analogy. Yeah. And it should be different every night when you perform. So yeah. My next one for you is, I'm going to say one thing. What is one thing?
Otherwise, we'll never get this done in 10 seconds.
I was like, we'll make it one. What's one thing that you noticed in a book that puts you off it?
Yeah. Good thing you don't do it so well. I was talking about this with, I don't know. So for me, it's like bad prose is the thing that puts me off the most. Cliches. There's no excuse, I think, in a published novel that has some kind of artistic pretension to it, to have cliches, to be leaning on cliches for meaning. Because the whole point of cliches is that we know what they mean already.
Yeah. And when you say cliches, do you mean cliches in terms of descriptions or cliches in terms of like more stereotypes and characters? And
bit of both. I mean, mostly descriptions, like linguistic cliches. The problem with writing is that you're bound to the words of the English language if you're writing in English, but you're responsible for the combinations you put them into, and you're responsible for trying to describe things in a way that someone else can't. So this comes back a bit to that point of view thing I was talking about earlier. Like I would describe something differently than you would, and that's good. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of art. The whole point of literature is that when I'm reading, like, it's like one of the things that I like so much about the Black Girl Magic anthology is that I'm reading words that I could never ever put down by definition, and the ways in which I could never put those down. This isn't the only reason I like the anthology, but it's like there's multiple. I don't even have to talk about them basically because the title of the anthology tells you a lot about that. And so if I go into that and I read a poem and it's telling me cliches that I've already read somewhere else, then why am I like, I could have written those cliches because I've read them else. I want to read something that I don't do. And what's great about that anthology is I don't read cliches. Now, some of the situations that I look at in that anthology might at first glance look like stereotype ones, might look like characters that I've seen before or whatever. I mean, it's poetry, so it's not really about characters necessarily, but actually the language is what makes them not,
Yeah.
and what makes them exciting. And there's some really, you know, so there's another poem in that anthology that talks about, it mentions Bigger Thomas in the middle of the poem, who's the character in Richard Wright's novel Native Son. And so there in some way the poet in that poem is acknowledging the kind of stock or stereotype character that she's centering her poem on, acknowledging that it's been written about before, but she's robbing the stereotype of it deliberately, because that's the whole part of the point of the novel, is to say, like, why are you giving into a stereotype that someone else is telling about you? And she's doing it in a way that only she can do. She's writing it in a poem that only she can write. And that, to me, that's what matters so much about language, about literary language, is that it does things, and a literary writer writes something that no one else could do. And so if I open a book and it's got cliches piling up, or just language that I've read, dead language that I've read before, not that every sentence has to be, you know, sparkling with wit or something, like, so F. Scott Fitzgerald, every sentence is just like immaculate. And it's what's amazing about Fitzgerald, because otherwise, like, what's the story of The Great Gatsby? Like, rich guy tries to impress girl. Like, ooh, like, there's nothing exciting about that story. What's exciting is about what he brings to it through the prose, and the insight that the prose brings to you. And that's always true. There's the stories. Yeah. So
yeah.
And then there's a million different examples of how that plays out. But so that was 10 seconds.
Perfect. Okay, so the final one is going to be, we're going to end on a really positive note. What do you do to celebrate the release of a new book?
Oh, good question. My first novel, I went out and bought a new pair of shoes.
Okay.
So my agent at that time, who sold the novel, laughed at me, and I think kind of rightly. I was just like, but I was like, I'd always wanted. It wasn't even a very exciting pair of shoes. I just was really excited that I had this money that I'd earned from the novel that I'd written. And I thought I could just like I can
buy the shoes.
I could just buy this buy this pair of shoes, and so I bought a pair of shoes. I don't know. It depends. You know, sometimes you have a launch party. Like my last novel, the publisher threw a celebration, and in fact, I celebrated, like, when I signed the contract. I like had a glass of champagne with my publisher, which was nice, because that kind of thing really makes you feel like a writer. That's like the only time in your life you feel like a writer with a capital W, is when you're signing a contract, and if your publisher is generous enough to like pour you a glass of champagne, and you're like, I think I've had that feeling really strongly twice. Once was signing the contract for Noon in Paris, 8 in Chicago with Myriad. It was really exciting for me, particularly after this long period of writing the novel, and then for someone to have this interest and be excited about it, and like, you know, it was a really big deal. And when my first novel was translated into French, I went to the offices of my French publisher, and I sat there with this guy, Christian Bourgois, who he's long since died, but I was sitting in his office talking to him, and he's this like quite impressive. He's kind of what you would imagine a French publisher of American literature to be. He and his wife Dominique run this publishing house, Christian Bourgois, and he was telling me about Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs. And I was sitting in this office, and you could see the Eiffel Tower out the window. And I was like, I didn't know what to do, because I was surprised that anyone wanted to publish my novel, let alone a French publisher. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm a writer. And I knew, I was smart enough to know that this wasn't going to be like the rest of my life was going to be like this, but it was like this moment, like this half hour of just sitting there chatting to him, and then I just thought, this is magic. I feel like a writer. I'm in Paris and talking
That's
to a
so good.
publisher, which is nice. That kind of thing kind of sustains you a bit sometimes. But I don't know that I like have a thing that I do to celebrate. I think, tell my friends that they better buy it. It is, which I don't mean to answer that way to suggest that it's not exciting, because it really is. Like, publishing a novel is always really exciting. But also, usually by the time a novel is actually being published, you finish the actual writing so long ago that you're thinking about other things anyway, and which isn't to do a disservice to the thing itself, the novel that under discussion, but it's become a different thing to you by the time it's published than it is to anyone else, and you're thinking about other things and what you're up to next. And I think I'm generally speaking not given to like great celebration of things anyway. I just enjoy them on my own kind of terms, but I'm not sure that's the answer you were looking for.
No, I love that. I love the range from buying shoes to just looking at the Eiffel Tower. A bit of both. No, that was great.
So maybe the next one I'll buy some shoes as close to the Eiffel Tower as I can, and
buy shoes in Paris.
There you go.
That's really bougie.
that suggests that I have any interest in shoes, which I basically don't.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Doug, for coming on to the podcast.
My pleasure.
Really fun.
Thanks for having me.
Eye-opening.
Oh, good. Thanks for having me.